This is the class on the residential purchase agreement. When you set up your purchase contract using your Zip account, which comes with your membership that you get for being a realtor. All you have to do is order the residential purchase agreement. It will set you up with all of these other documents. And this will be the first document that you present to your client. So it's the first document in this package. This is a disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. Most of you have heard me describe this form before, but I'm going to go through it again. Purposes of being thrown in this class. Disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships is required by the California Civil Code to be given to all buyers and sellers, and as one of the first documents that you do once you decide to either list the property or represent a buyer by putting an offer. It's also, just a side note, it's also required for property management clients. Purpose of this document is not necessarily to tell the client which form of agency you have with them. It is to tell them what the different types of agency are. There are three main types. You have a seller's agent, you have a buyer's agent, and you have an agent that represents both the seller and the buyer. The seller's agent, if you look there, I've underlined a few key passages, but essentially they have a duty of utmost care, integrity, honesty, and loyalty in their dealings with either the seller or the buyer. And actually, it's in their dealings with. So typically you will have, if you're a seller's agent, listing agent, also known as listing agent, your sole duty at that point is to the seller. And what the duty really is you owe them a fiduciary duty, which requires you to try to get them highest price, best terms property. A buyer's agent has an opposite duty. They have a duty to get their client into the property, the lowest price and the best terms. So you're butting heads a little bit to begin with. But what you always need to remember, and if you look under both of these duties, it talks about to the buyer and the seller, and it talks about to the buyer and the seller. They owe all of them a duty of honest and fair dealing and good faith. And that really means that no matter who you're representing, you still owe a duty of honest dealing and good faith to the person on the other side of the transaction. It's not to say that you can't make tactical decisions that will benefit the client. But what it means is you can't be dishonest. So just keep that in mind. I talked before about just kind of following the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, like you. And if you operate that way in your real estate practice, you will make many colleagues, acquaintances throughout your career that will enjoy doing transactions with you because they know you're a straight shooter. So there you have seller's agent, buyer's agent, and then you have this little anomaly here, an agent that represents both buyer and seller, or seller and buyer. So there you also have a fiduciary duty of utmost care, integrity, honesty, and loyalty towards either the seller or buyer. But what does agent representing both buyer and seller mean? Well, you may or may not have heard the term dual agency. Those of you who have been in my classes or have. And the big thing here is dual agent covers two different types of relationship. One is where an agent lists a property, and then that same agent that listed the property also finds and represents a buyer for that property. So it's one agent representing buyer and the seller. That's the classic dual agency. The other type of dual agency that honestly many experienced agents who've been around the block a long time still haven't figured out, they don't understand, is where you have an agent that lists the property. They're representing the seller. And then, and we use our office here for an example. We have somewhere in the range of 260, 270 salespeople and associate brokers that are under the license of Keller Williams SAC Metro. So in that particular example, let's just say Bill listed a property and it goes into the MLS, and one of the other agents, one of the other 270 or 280 agents in this office, they have a client and they see that pop up on their listing feed that they get from their agent. Shows there's this new listing out there. Well, let's just say that agent that's representing that buyer also works out of Keller Williams SAC Metro. Bill has never met that agent. He's never heard of that agent. If he bumped into him on the street, he wouldn't know who he was. But because both Bill and that other agent is representing the buyer that put in an offer that was accepted on this property, are under the same brokerage license, which is Keller Williams SAC Metro, that too becomes dual agency. This is important to understand and know when you write your offer, because when you write your offer, you're going to fill in the name of the listing broker, you're going to fill in your information, and you need to be able to check the boxes on the first page of the actual sales contract and state who is representing who. And if it's dual agency, if you're representing the buyer and the seller. And like I said, if both agents are in the same office, you are both representing the buyer and the seller. And that's the check boxes. And you'll see that when we get to it. Coming down a little bit farther. Let's see. So here, you're going to have the buyer sign before you get to the rest of the documents in this package. The agent, now they have clarified on the actual form. It used to not have this right here. I think in the last few years they started putting it, but it used to be people with agents, sales type their name here, and then they would sign it here. Well, what this is really asking, the agent is actually the broker. You as salespeople or associate brokers, you represent the broker. So you're always going to put the brokerage here. This is the broker's number as assigned by the Department of Real Estate. And if you're ever in doubt as to what somebody's license number is or what license number they have, you can always go to dre.ca.gov, go to the link consumers, and then verify license, and key in a last name or a company, and it will give you all this information right there. You can even look yourselves up. So this is the brokerage number. This is my number. Now, one way that you can tell if you're not sure, one way you can tell if there's dual agency, if this number is exactly the same for the buyer's agent and the seller's agent. You have second page of the disclosure regarding agency relationship. You don't have to really explain anything to your client for this. Just tell them what I usually say is, look, the second page is just the legal verbiage that's right out of the civil code. It does have some interesting tidbits in it, telling you guys that this your benefit. If you're ever curious, this is the actual legal definition of what an agent is, buyer is, what a listing agreement means, what a seller is, kind of common sense stuff with something like this. That's but I just tell the clients this is just the civil code version. What I've told you about 3 types of agency, that's what's really. And then last but not least, I do want to point out to you guys, because this deals with core duty. When you have dual agency, you would think that dual agency makes it easier, right? Because you're like the master puppeteer. You're controlling everything on this side of the transaction. You're controlling everything on that side of the transaction. And for the after contractual issues, that there might be some truth to that. It does make it easier. The problem with dual agency is in any negotiation, because it actually limits you to what you might be able to say, what you can't say, because of the simple fact that you have dual agency. So when you have dual agency, if you were to, even if you know or you can find out that the seller might be willing to let it go for a little bit less than it's listed for, you can't tell that to the buyer. So even though you have a duty to your buyer, you cannot tell them that. Likewise, if you know that the buyer is willing to pay more than the seller is really hoping to get out of the property, you can't tell the buyer, you can't tell the buyer or seller that. So you gotta really, really be careful what you say when you have dual agency, because it's very easy to violate your fiduciary. And fact of the matter is, dual agency situations are one of the main reasons for lawsuits by clients. And it is so bad. I'm in the middle of renewing one of our E&O policies right now, and I've done this, renewing policies each year for couple decades. And one of the questions that's always asked on the application when you describe the previous year's business, what percentage of transactions out of your office? Because there's a lot of suits and it makes the risk higher. All right, next page, Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisor. I know you guys are probably sick of hearing me talk about this. It comes up in every listing class, every purchase contract class, because it's part of that package. And it's also part of a separate class that I give on fair housing coverage. But it is also that important. And in fact, this form was actually one of the ones they did in December, and then they modified it again in June. They tried to make, in June modification, they tried to make the display of classifications of people that are discriminated against a little bit easier to read and understand. But basically, fair housing in a nutshell involves discriminating against various people based on their class, based on a classification. That classification can be related to race, national origin, age, physical disability, any number of these statuses that you see here, these characteristics you see. The predominant form of discrimination, even in liberal California, is still race discrimination. And it's seen in real estate sales, it's seen in lending, it is seen in property management. And so that's why we have to talk about this. As I said, I do a separate class on this, but I want to cover some key points here. By the way, if you get popped with a fair housing violation, you are going to, I can guarantee you, license is going to, you may or may not ever get it back. And there are monetary penalties, and under some federal statutes, there are substantial criminal penalties. So this is something you got to be conscious of. And the tough thing about fair housing is you don't have to be the stereotypical racist walking around in a white hat to be guilty of a fair housing violation. You can commit a fair housing violation without any actual intent, but purely by stupidity or lack of understanding what certain things are. And so that's what we kind of want to get at. I can't imagine that, that way the world is today, we're going to have a lot of people that are overt discriminating against people based on race, color, religion, any of that stuff. It's going to be the accidental ones that result from stupidity, that are going to arise. And I'm going to give a couple of examples. The biggest examples of discrimination typically fall within something called steering or blockbusting. And I'm going to give you a few quick examples so you understand what they are and how to avoid them. So when we talk about steering is the idea of, and it usually happens when working with a buyer. And the scenario is something like this. You get a call from a qualified buyer, and I personally believe that when you have a buyer you're going to start working with, you need to have them come in, meet with you, you go through a needs analysis with them, you figure out what kind of property they're interested in buying, the specifics of, about the house, the specification, how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, single story, two-story, age issues with the house, they okay with an older one, new one, and of course we've got price point looking at, and whether or not they're pre-approved. And if they aren't pre-approved and they aren't a cash buyer, you want to get them set up with a plan to help guide them through that. Well, the other question that you really need to get them to help you understand is where they are. So the point I'm trying to make is, ideally, the client is going to tell you the areas of geography, community or city, that you're going to search for properties that meet criteria. The worst thing that can happen is they either don't know or they won't tell you where specifically they want to live. And you make an assumption because, and the example I'll use is you have a person, an African-American client buyer who says, yeah, find me a house, I'm qualified for this. And you limit your search, you think, okay, I'm going to put them with where I think people of color are living, and you search the area around Martin Luther King. Well, you've just committed a fair housing violation. You might have ignorantly been trying to do the right thing, but that's not the right thing. You should, and I don't think I've talked about this before. We actually had someone who made an allegation against an agent here, saying that they were steering situations similar to that, not that exact situation, but similar to that. And fortunately for this agent, he had saved every one of his text messages going back and forth with this client, which showed the total opposite, that he was looking for stuff all over. So, communication, when you're communicating, I love it when it's in writing instead of calls. When you get done meeting with somebody in person, do a email back to them later that says, as we discussed, we're going to set up a search within these following areas for you. We're looking for properties that have 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a minimum of 1,500 square feet, single story, 2-story, doesn't matter. Yes, you're looking for one under section such. So you have something documenting what the discussion was. That's always best. Anyway, that would be steering. You're steering somebody towards a certain area, or steering somebody away from a certain. Somebody says, well, I want to live over here, and you steer them to a completely different area where you think a person of that classification person would want to live. Again, same thing, steering, it's a fair housing violation. Block busting, this is probably going to be boring for many of you who've heard me tell this story before. We had an actual case of block busting that I'm aware of that occurred in the mid-2000s, early mid-2000s. And this was a case that occurred over here in Thomas Park. There's a section on Del Paso Road where the charter school, the Performing Arts Center on that end now. And right in back of those houses, and that school, is a big empty strip of land that goes from Del Paso Road all the way down to Elko. And many years ago, there was an agent, and he was knocking on doors, the homes in the Thomas Park that back to that open field. And his spiel that he would give to homeowners was something to the effect of, hello, ma'am, my name is so-and-so, I'm a realtor with such and such company. I'm not sure if you're aware of it or not, but they're planning on building low-income apartments in the strip of land right behind your home. And it's low-income apartments, so there's going to be crime that comes with it. So if you're planning on selling, now would be that is blockbusting. That is the classic example of blockbusting. And here we are, 17, 18 years later. There's still been no apartments that have been built there, let alone low-income apartments. It was just, excuse me, keep the noise on. I'm recording this for. Thank you. So that's the kind of thing that is blatantly illegal. He probably knew it was illegal, did it. And that particular agent, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but he actually had his license suspended after that. Not for that reason, though. They got him for a scheme in short sales. So I guess, if you have a propensity to do that kind of shady stuff, you're going to probably do it more than once. And he ended up getting. The other thing, too, you can get nailed for easily is in advertising listing. So the example here, I'll give you a quick, easy one to avoid. And many of you have heard me talk about this before. When you're doing your marketing comments and putting them into the MLS, type of fair housing violation they're talking about here would be something like, there's describe the house and you do a great job on that. And then at the very end, usually at the very end of my marketing descriptions is where I put something like close proximity to downtown Sacramento, airport, freeways, and shops, something like that. Well, in this case, the agent might put something like walking distance to community park. Well, that is potentially, believe it or not, a fair housing violation because under the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are many people that are in wheelchairs, they can't walk. And so, the fair housing police, I use that term kind of jest, but there are attorneys that make a living by scouring MLS, marketing advertisement. They may have heard of this one attorney who made a really good living going into the small mom and pop businesses, and if the restrooms on premises weren't ADA compliant, he would file nuisance suits and he would get large settlements because they couldn't afford trial. The thing about fair housing violations, especially ones that they file under the federal court system, is that there are provisions in the actual laws. These provisions are designed to help the victims, but there are provisions in the laws that guarantee attorney fees to the prevailing attorney. So that's why you have many attorneys that will take these cases free, because they know that as long as it's a clear-cut fair housing violation, they're going to get paid. You can make a pretty good living out of this just by filing suits, waiting for people to settle. And that's what you're up against. So, you got to avoid this stuff. There was one other example of a case I read about, and I've talked about this one before, and I can't remember the exact phrase that was said, but it was an agent that was hunting down a property, and his client was Jewish. And essentially, he said, Mr. Shapiro, I have found the perfect house for you. It is in the Jewish area of town, right next to a synagogue. And that, again, he was trying to help the guy out. He thought in his mind he was doing the right thing. That is a fair housing violation. So you just gotta think. When in doubt, don't say it. Don't write it down. That's kind of the general. And again, I do a separate class on fair housing. So this is just a teaser of the next document you're going to find in the purchase contract package that you'll print out of zip forms is this form. It's called a possible representation of one buyer or seller to split consent. And this form here, the most important piece of it is just another rehash of what a pool agency is. But main purpose of it is to tell buyers and sellers, look, we're a brokerage, we employ many agents, we work with many buyers and sellers all over the place. If a buyer decides to buy the house over here instead of the house over here, it's the buyer's decision, not ours. Don't sue us if they don't buy your house. And that's basically what this form is. Just another piece of CYA for us as a brokerage to do sort of this. The important thing I want to point out here is this paragraph right here. You notice it says, and most agents don't know this. Offers are not necessarily confidential. Buyer is advised that the seller or the listing agent disclose existence, term, and conditions of a buyer's offer, unless, and this is big unless, all parties and their agent have signed a written confidentiality. So why is this important? This is important because it means that a listing agent who you guys are putting an offer in on, if he wanted to, absent a written confidentiality agreement, he is free to fully disclose the terms of your offer in order to raise somebody else's offer, get competitive bid. Now, whether he does this or not, it's entirely up to him, he and the seller. It's entirely up to the current market, what's going on, what his marketing plan is. It might be a type of market where it would be advantageous to that. It might be a market where it's advantageous just to say, well, I've already got offers over asking, and let them guess as to what. And that's oftentimes what we'll do. We'll say, we'll get a call from an agent. They'll say, do you have any offers? Yes. How many do you have? Can you tell us? Well, I've got 3 offers on the table right now. And if they don't ask, sometimes we'll offer. We'll say, one of them is at list, 2 of them are over asking. And that's as much as I'm going to tell them. But if I wanted to, unless the seller objects, and unless there's a written confidentiality, do that. But the last thing I would tell the other agent is I highly suggest just make the highest and best offer. So that's the let's say there. And then again, you're going to put brokerage name here, the brokerage license number. You're going to put your name, your license number, sign. And then the other sides of the transaction, as well as the buyer and seller, they also sign. Wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory. I think I've told most of you before. This is just because we have these codes that are sitting in Russia and other countries that have figured out ways to separate buyers and sellers from their money. Usually in a real estate transaction, it involves either getting a buyer to send their earnest money deposit out of the country to some out-of-state account, or it involves getting a seller to offer their account number and stuff and have that substituted in so that their proceeds end up going to that account. This is just an extra warning to make you beware that there are a lot of folks out there that are committing wire. And we finally get to the actual California Residential Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrow Instructions. It's a pretty big form. This most recent revision that they did in December of 2021 was the most radical revision they've done since December of 2002. And I'll talk about some of those differences in a second. First difference is most of the main terms contract you can see right on the front page. Actually, the first couple pages. They set up this little grid and everything that's important find you. Used to be with the last version, we had to actually flip page after page after page. We had to get to paragraph 14 to figure out what inspection period that was in the contract was set up for, and one page we had to go to that was going to be owner occupied investment property, all sorts of stuff like that. This form here makes it nice and easy. Gotta say, my own personal experience, the first time I saw this new form in action, hadn't gone to a class on it yet. So just trying to figure out where everything had moved around to was a bit of a shock on my system. But as I've been using it, reviewing more and more of these contracts, dealing with clients' issues and stuff, I think I've come to enjoy it. So first thing we'll talk about, the name of the form, California Residential Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrow Instructions. Most people just refer to it as part. Nowhere up there does it say I am a contract. It doesn't. But that's exactly what this is. The contract doesn't have to say it's a contract to be a contract. In terms of real property transfers, statute of frauds requires it in writing. But even under normal contract law, oral contracts are fine in many circumstances. Oral contracts are fine for the sale of goods under $500. You don't have to have some. Oral contracts are fine for service between you and your contractor, you and your handyman, you and your plumber. Now, various states put requirements to have stuff. California requires a contract agreement for a certain amount of money to be in writing, but generally a service contract doesn't have. Real estate contracts do. There are also certain requirements that have to go into a document that make it an enforcement contract. You have to have, it has to be dated. It has to have a offeree and an offeror, buyer and a seller, right? It has to have a subject matter. The subject matter in the case of this is the property, and it has to have consideration, which would be the price. You remember from real estate class, it's learn it over and over. Contracts have to have an offer, acceptance, consideration. Well, it is those. There's a few more little details there. I told this to somebody recently. I didn't talk about it in a class. There's case law actually out of California. Talked about the statute of frauds requires a contract for the sale of real property to be in writing. Well, there's an old case in California of an offeror meeting with an offeree, two friends. They're sitting at a restaurant or a bar, and one of them pulls out a napkin. They're talking about one selling their property to the other. They write out the terms on a paper napkin at a restaurant. And then later on, the one trying to buy the one offering to sell the property tried to renege and breached on the contract. The other guy took him to court, went all the way up to the California Supreme Court, and they said, I don't care if it's on a paper napkin. It met the statute of fraud. It is a valid binding contract. So it doesn't take much. We use these fancy forms that are produced by ZIP, California Association of Realtors. There are other cities and counties in California that do not use ZIP. They have their own forms that they use. But as long as it has the terms in them, they are valid contracts. But we get these through our membership in realtors, so why not? The other advantage of using these forms is if there is ever a challenge to the legality of something, one of the pre-printed passages or contract terms that are in the form, the California Association would back that in representing for us. So moving on to the form, we have, this is a dummy fake contract. It's an offer from John Smith, the buyer. These forms are really easy to fill in. I mean, all the fields are really self-explanatory. The way you get into trouble with this type of form, though, is it lulls you into a sense of confidence. And the problem is there are certain things in here, when you're filling it out for your client in order to submit to a seller and hopefully get it accepted. There are certain things in here that if you don't give yourself enough days, for example, to get a loan. If you make your contingencies for inspections too early, when there's a problem getting home inspectors because the market's still too crazy, or there's a problem getting appraisers because the market's too, you could actually put your client in breach of the contract. And one of two things happens there. Either they're going to have to remove their contingencies, which we'll talk about, and potentially their deposit, or they're going to have to cancel the purchase and lose out on the property. You don't want that. So, but we'll go through the easier stuff first. The simple stuff, like who's the seller brokerage, also known as the listing. So in this case here, you're going to put the name of the firm, broker's license, the agent's name, the agent's license. You're going to indicate who that person's representing. So in this case, it's the seller's agent. But he could also be the buyer's agent if his information is down here too, or if it's another agent from his office. You know that because this number, this name, and this name here, this number here will be identical. That's how you know this is an equal agency. But if it's a different brokerage, this one is going to represent the buyer owner. You're not going to check. And then buyer's agent's name here, that person's license, and buyer's agent. So that's easy. And I put a note here just to remember that dual agency is determined by the brokerage, not the salesperson. All right. Next section you get to is where you start filling in all boxes. Now, talked a moment ago, purchase price. I mean, your client is qualified for X amount of a loan. That means you can get a purchase price of X, but keep in mind too, when you're representing a buyer, before you go offering whatever the list price is, do your due diligence. Make sure, run a quick market analysis on that house. Just because it's listed at $600,000 doesn't mean the house is worth $6,000. I mean, the house might only be worth $500, but if you don't check the comps and you offer $6,000, the seller, and he's got enough of a down payment where it's not going to affect whether the appraisal comes in. If he offers $600, the offer gets accepted, and then the buyer later finds out, why the hell did I pay $100,000 more than it was really worth? My agent should have told me that. He's the professional. We have a problem. So you don't have to come up with an exact value, but you at least want to do your due diligence, pull some comps, and see if they're in that price. Now you got to recognize too, if it were a year ago, we're in this market where every week it seems it's going up higher and higher in value. Well, yeah, it might only be comp based on the sales today at 550, but it's not unreasonable. 575 would be the fair market value 30 days from now. So you can make minor adjustments like that in your thinking. But just make sure you're covering your client and doing your fiduciary. Close of escrow. This is, close of escrow, loan terms, inspection periods, things like that. And we'll get to the inspection periods. But those are all conversations that you need to have with the buyer's loan officer before you write this up. Okay. If we're in a hot, crazy market and it's taking 40 days to get a deal closed because there's a backup on getting appraisals, backup on getting home inspections, everything's all backed up, you don't want to put a 30-day close. If your buyer is doing Cal HAPA down payment assistance, so that there's like big loan, big FHA loan, a smaller down payment loan. And so they're basically doing 100% financing, but you're going through two different underwriting processes. You know, 30 days may definitely not be enough time. So you want to find out what a realistic time frame is post escrow. And then along that conversation, you're going to be talking to the lender. How much time am I going to need for a loan contingency? Is it the 17 days or 21 days, or do I need more than that? Because here's what happens. Whatever the terms are that's in this contract, the other agent or a transaction coordinator on the other side is, once you get that ratified contract, meeting of the mind, buyer and seller agree on all these terms. There has to go through counter offers first or not. At some point, it's either going to fall apart, there's not going to ever be a contract, or there's going to be a ratified contract. If that ratified contract says that you have 30-day close, you have 17-day or 21-day loan contingency, 17-day appraisal contingency, 17-day inspection, blah, blah, blah. The transaction coordinator on the other side is going to look at their calendar from the date that contract was ratified. So the date of ratification is day 0. The very next day is day 1. Counting starts from there. If the end date, the end of the 17th day or the 21st day or the 30th day, whatever it is that you measure, falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, it automatically goes over to next business. And that's the date you're supposed to perform that particular part of the contract. If you fail to do that on that day, the seller can send over a notice to perform. Once the seller sends over a notice to perform, your client then has 2 business days to perform. They're supposed to do, whether that's move their inspection contingency, move their loan contingency, whatever it is, they have 2 business days. If they fail to do that on the second day, the seller can just issue a cancellation letter. No further questions, no further second chances. That's it. Buyer has lost the house. So you've got to stay on top of those dates. You've got to be sure of the dates when you plug them in the contract. There's nothing worse than being on a buyer side and having to go back to a listing agent and say, hey, I put the wrong date here. I should have asked for this much time. Lender is not able to do it in that amount of time and get an extension. Sometimes they may grant them, sometimes no. You don't know what the plans are of the seller. You don't know they had food trucks like they're ready to eat feet, get the hell out of California. You just don't know what their situation is. So best way to avoid this problem, communicate ahead of time and put the right stuff. Expiration of offer. The default is 3 days after buyer signature. Those aren't business days, those are 3 calendar days. So if you write this contract today, on the 3rd calendar day at 5 p.m., this contract expires. So today is Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday at 5 p.m. This contract is expired. And legally, you actually enforce the contract terms. The seller can no longer sign it as an acceptance at that after 5 p.m. Practically, a lot of agents will do that, and everybody just pretends that it's a valid contract. Theoretically, the proper response would to send on the expiration to have the seller sign. But that doesn't happen. Initial deposit amount. In this case, for the dummy contract, $5,000. This 1% that is shown here, that's just for information calculation. This is all. That is not saying that 1% is required. It's not. It's just telling you that the amount there is 1% of the purchase price. Now, in countering back and forth, the other side might want to see a higher earnest money deposit. The fact of the matter is, the earnest money deposit is what is used as liquidated damages if the buyer were to default. So liquidated damages. Is that a phone? Liquidated damages are what the buyer uses, what the seller uses to get their damages by. California courts have said that a seller can retain up to 3% purchase price. So up to 3% of the purchase price, if the buyer defaults, by default, I mean fails to close after they have removed all of their contingency. That's the criteria for default. When we're talking about the buyer, the seller being able to retain the buyer's earnest deposit. So this 5,000 is 1%. They went 15,000, that would be 3% of the purchase price. That would be the maximum seller retain. Does that mean that the buyer is limited to putting up 15,000 as a deposit? No. Just means that if things were to go south and the seller decides they want to try and retain buyer's EMD as liquidated damages, out of the $50,000 earnest money deposit, they're only allowed to retain 15,000. That's the amount. And if you're working in the Bay Area, it is not uncommon. When I worked in the Bay Area selling real estate, it was not uncommon to have buyers get $100,000. Now, even though the price points were a lot higher, they weren't that high. Just down here, customs are different. Let's see here. Oh, the earnest money deposit amount. So the initial deposit. It used to be that when we worked with a buyer, they were going to be writing a check for their earnest money deposit. By the way, guys, if you are tired, you need to stand up, feel free to do so. It will not offend me. This is like, contracts are very boring subjects, and I don't have the charisma of a comedian, so feel free to stand up if you need to. So prior to the what was the last version? All the agents used to do when they represented buyers is they would have the buyer complete a check, earnest money deposit, and they would write on the payee line. They would save a little space on the left side of the payee, and then on the right side they would write title company. So whatever title company was decided upon for the transaction, once there was a ratified contract, they would write in the name of that title company and have that check couriered over or delivered to that title. The problem is, oftentimes agents were hanging onto those checks, and that's a DRE violation. The earnest money deposit checks are considered trust funds. DRE has special requirements for how you may maintain trust funds, handle those checks. What they actually require is that a brokerage have established a check. You have to log in each of those checks that receive, and then you have to store it in a safe place. And once the check is leased to a title company, you got to make note of the date, time, which leased to, when, and all that stuff. And if you fail to do that, you're in violation of trust fund handling. That's DRE, and they can actually pay the license. So it's not a good thing, which is why the contracts were designed to state that within 3 days, with 3 or blank, join different number of days, business days after acceptance, by wire transfer, they're going to the earnest money deposit wire will that to takes it totally out of our hands, which is the way we want it. I'm going to mention this really quickly. Increased deposit. You won't normally see an increased deposit, which is contrary. The way this will typically come up. So I already said that liquidated damages are limited to 3%. So in this example, they could be as high as 15,000. There's only 5,000. let's just say we're moving through the transaction, and as oftentimes happens, buyer can't perform within the time frame that they have to get their. So the seller's agent says to you, okay, look, I can see you're trying to get this done, but my client needs some more protection. You know, they're flying out on the limb here waiting for your client. I'll tell you what, if your client agrees to increase their earnest money deposit and remove their loan contingency today, they have to increase their earnest money deposit by $10,000 to a total of $15,000. And then remove their loan contingencies, so they have no contingencies left. I will give them an extra 2 weeks to get escrow. But in 2 weeks, if you can't perform, I get liquidated damages. Okay, that's all well and good, and you're saying, yeah, I got keeping this deal together. And the seller saying, yeah, I'm gonna get more money. I'm covered now. I'm protected. Here's the rub. There's a form, and I highlighted it there. It's called a DID. The way the law on liquidated damages works in California, I can't speak to other states, but in California, you have to specifically reference in a written document that is executed by both parties that if you increase the deposit, the increase will not be allowed to be part of liquidated damages unless you have a separate document that specifically says. That's what this form DI is. So anytime you get into a situation where somebody floats that idea of increasing the earnest money deposit, get more money in escrow, you want to associate that DID. Just remember, you probably won't come up very often, but just remember, yeah, I think I remember Bruce saying there's some other form I'm looking into. Remember that, go find the form, you can ask, somebody will tell you. Loan amount, pretty simple. You're just going to key in what the information lender is giving you. There's one little spot that's covered up by the crease between the monitors right here. And that's talking about fixed rate or initial adjustable interest rate not to exceed X. So that particular field, remember I told you earlier on in this class, I said, form is pretty simple. Just fill stuff. Just fill in the blanks. It's the stuff that you don't realize, the stuff you don't know that bite you. But well, this is one of those little fields. So this person, this time, let's just say they're actually qualified for at this time they were qualified for a 5%, right? Well, if you don't put an amount in this field, let's just say between the time they got their pre-approval, you wrote the contract, and the time, and you didn't fill anything into that box, and the time that they get into final underwriting, and they hadn't locked their loan yet, and now their loan rate, instead of being 5, their loan rate is at 6.5, and at 6.5, with their ratios, they no longer qualify for the loan. And now they can't go through with the deal because they can't clear it, even though they have a loan contingency in place. If you did not fill in a maximum amount for them to go through with the deal, that field there, they cannot use the loan contingency as a way of getting out of the sale, keeping this money. So they are in default. And basically, by putting a number there, you could have saved that. So keep that in mind. You want to make sure you complete the section. If it's conventional financing, you don't need to do it. But if it's FHA or VA financing, or if there's like down payment assistance or something, that's where you're going to check boxes on this stuff. The other thing too, there's 2 points that I'm going to. If your buyer is an FHA or VA buyer, there's one additional form that you're going to need, and it's called a FHBA form, I think, or something like that. We'll get to it for sure. But essentially, if it's an FHA or a VA buyer, federal law states that the buyer cannot be made responsible to go through with the purchase if the property doesn't appraise. So we're gonna for an FHA and VA buyer, we'll take that one step further. Let's just say that the buyer filled out this contract, went over and he was doing his contingencies, and he checked no loan contingency, no appraisal. So you think, as a seller, you think, yeah, it's got to be pretty solid, no loan contingency, appraisal contingency. But and we'll take it to one more extreme. He didn't fill out the special form that said the house has to appraise at that point. Whether he filled out the form or not, the form is basically a disclosure where it says the seller was, but the form does not enforce the law. What I mean by that is, it has been deemed by the federal government that is term they use is against public policy for a veteran or an FHA home buyer to waive away their rights to have property appraised and get loan. So even if they intentionally waive those rights away, it is against public policy to acknowledge that. So it's unenforceable law. So on an FHA or VA buyer, property must appraise. Now, that being said, if the property didn't appraise, the seller can save the deal by saying, fine, I'll drop the purchase price to the amount appraised. Or it could be saved because the buyer says, I know I'm a veteran and I know I don't have to buy it, but I'm willing, in order to get the loan, I'm willing to actually come up with a down to bridge the difference in the low appraisal. And if the buyer on their own says, I'm willing to do that, same with FHA, then the deal can go through. The law doesn't say that the buyer can't buy. It says that the seller can't force the buyer to buy if it doesn't. And the seller can't take action if the buyer refuses. All right. All right, so this section here, we would fill all this information if there was secondary financing, talking about down payment assistance, something like that. You hear the term CalHAFA, that's down payment assistance. That's really important. Occupancy type. If it's going to be owner occupant, you don't need to do anything. If it's going to be a second home, we would check here. If it's going to be an investment property, check. That is a disclosable issue on your part because there are federal laws that have to deal with lending and how people are treated when they're an investor versus a owner occupant. There are state laws that come into play. You'll find out if, as the market continues to shift, if we start seeing more foreclosures on the market, there are specific requirements. If you're going to write an offer on property that has a notice of default filed by a bank against it, there are actually special forms. In some cases, investors can't put offers in. And that's why it's important for the seller to know how the classification of the buyer. Of course, you want to make sure your buyer's initials all of these pages. You're representing a seller. You want to make sure the buyer is initialed at every spot that requires initials, and that your seller initials spot that requires initials. Without the initials, this page is inoperative in terms of the contract, which happens on this page. Basically, the contract's invalid. Boy. Moving up here. All right. So this field here, by the way, Looking at the left column here, that is referring to this specific grid thing. The number that's right here, or the number and letter combination, that is referring to the broad discussion and description on each of the positions. So if you're in doubt as to what something means here, 10A, 11A, you can go down into the contract and 10A here and 11A. Form makes it nice and easy. Time less than an hour. All right, so this paragraph here, the section G1, you're going to see this right now becoming much more prevalent because what you're seeing right now in a lot of transaction is because sellers are trying to attract buyers and interest rates are so high. You're seeing a lot of sellers that are buy down buyers loan credit as part of the transaction. That's where you would use this. Again, like doing a secondary financing, you can probably also point that out for description here. If it's an all cash buyer, if you're representing a buyer and it's a cash buyer, ideally, when you submit that offer to the seller, in addition to all these offer forms, contracts, you want to have a copy of buyer's bank statements, investment account statements, whatever they're using to show they have cashed this purchase. You ideally want to tell your client, look, you need a current statement within the last 30 days, bank, whatever it is, black out the account this morning. So some can't use them, go out on. But I need those, you need to be able to submit those with your offer. If it's a financed buyer, you're going to submit a pre-approval letter. That letter should also be, when I look at a pre-approval letter the buyer's given me, and you should do the same. All lenders are not equal. There's a lot of fly-by-night people that try to get into lending. They'll issue a pre-approval letter that's not what the papers. They will not state they have reviewed the buyer's credit. When you get those, they'll be. It's almost like listening to a politician speak. What they do is they'll mince their words in a certain way, like they'll say, you know, based on extensive discussions with the client about his employment and credit, you know, we are approving this person for a loan of X amount of dollars with our premium, platinum, extra doozy, special, wonderful. Well, what they did is they asked the buyer where they worked, how long the buyer has worked there. And they said to him, how's your credit? And they said, oh, I have great credit. But they never actually pulled a credit report. They never actually did a VOE verification of employment. They didn't do any due diligence at all yet, but they issued this fancy schmancy pre-approval letter to try to get them into contract and facilitate wasting everybody's time on transactions. So make sure you actually read pre-approval letters that you get. And if you follow my advice, you're going to be talking to that loan officer anyway before you write this off, because you're going to want to know how long do you need to have this for underwriting? How long are you going to need to get credit? So on and so. So you're going to have an excuse to reach out to them anyway. Just make sure that they are a mainstream lender, or that you're satisfied that they've actually done their due diligence. They can tell you what the credit score is. They can't tell you what the person's credit score is. They haven't run the credit. Don't let them bamboozle. So that's all this section right here is. It's verification of whether they have cash, whether they have down payment and closing costs. And sometimes you're really lucky. Lender's already done the loan application. They've already done the verification of employment. They've verified the amounts of money in bank accounts. They pulled credit. They've even done automated underwriting. Yeah. And so they're good to go. They're golden. That's the best of all of them. And if you find out they're already completely fully underwritten and their goal, when you get that offer over to the listing agent, you are of course going to put that in your email when you're sending it over to them, because that's helpful for the listing agents when they're pitching your offer to their seller. I mean, that stuff is gold. That can help get the deal. Final verification of condition. This form, you've seen it, it's called verification of property. That's what this is. Final verification. Contract gives you the legal right to get the client into the property within 5 days before the escrow closes. So sometimes you'll get pushback from sellers, from listing agents. Well, it's not convenient. I don't care if it's convenient. We have a contractual right to go in and do our final walk within any time within 5 days of escrow. We want to exercise that when we come over and get it scheduled. Now, is this meant to be another home inspection? No. This is meant to be a quick 5-10 minute walk through the house. Just make sure that there's no major, you haven't punched a hole in the wall, driven a car in the garage, in the kitchen, and something like that. That's all it is. But key thing here is that verification of property form needs to be signed by your buyer before it closes escrow. 1 day after it closes escrow, or even on the same day that it closes escrow, that form is invalid. So, client purposes, make sure you get it signed before. Assignment request, you'll run into this on a rare occasion. This is typically, how many of you, have ever seen late night get rich quick real estate commercial? They have. I know when I was younger, they had them on all the time. But essentially, you got these people, and they call them bird dogs, and they make money, not as much as they'd like, sure, but they make money searching for opportunities for these people that have deep wallets, these investors. And they will locate a property, and they'll contact you, and they'll say, hey, I want to buy this property. And they'll show you like a letter of credit from some other company. And or they might even have, show you their own personal proof of assets to buy the house cash. And what they'll do is they'll get into contract, and then at some point during the escrow, they will attempt to assign the contract, purchase contract, to another party. And that's perfectly fine, because they have up to 17 days after acceptance where they can do that. Typically, the reasoning behind their scheme, there's nothing nefarious about it. The person finds the property, locks it up in contract, assigns the contract to somebody else who then completes the purchase. They take title in their name, and then they pay a finder's fee outside of the transaction to the builder. That's all. It doesn't happen all that often. That may come up, and that would be the reason somebody to assign. After 17 days, the seller does not have to rent. First 17 days, the seller cannot unreasonably refuse. Loan contingency. Let's see in this one, I did not, all of these, by the way, take a 12 to 17 days. You don't do anything else, it'll be there at 17 days. I put in 21 days. You could also, as I said, go no loan contingency. That's what I'm encouraging you to do. I personally kind of crazy doing that. I've done that before. I know what I'm doing. This is the Bay Area. I knew what the property was worth. I went into no loan inspection. I got the deal. Probably read it inspection later, but nonetheless, you can do that if I was encouraging you to. but position that you should always take with your client, you always recommend a complete home inspection, potentially a pest inspection, roof inspection, and things that they wish to. If the property has a well and septic system, you also want to build in a contract, and show you the section in a few minutes on how to do that. But want to definitely get a well and septic inspection. Anytime you're dealing with rural property, that's definitely got get that in a second. Let's see, investigation of property, that's the buyer's inspection. And again, I just said, always want client inspection. I don't care if they're an experienced buyer, if they're buying a new home, recommend they get a home inspection. I bought a house here in Thomas Park in 2002. I paid for a home inspection before my field service person took me around. The home inspector went in with us, found a couple dual pane windows that were foul. They needed replaced on a brand new home. Now, I don't know if the cost of 2 dual pane windows would have been equivalent of the home inspection, probably a wash. And realistically, if I found that, if I had discovered later 2 failed pane windows, would have been under builder warranty anyway, if I found them right away. But, that was a minor thing. There could be significant issues. There were a bunch of new homes on the other side of the freeway built by Beasley's. They had significant foundation issues. So stuff happened. Also on the subject of home inspections, just a side note, I talk about this in other classes. When you're going to get into a situation where you're representing a buyer, you put an offer in on the property, and let's just say that seller had previously had that property under contract, and the escrow fell for one reason. If that previous buyer had done any kind of inspections, contract requires that buyer give the seller copies of those inspections. And the reason is the seller then has to disclose those reports to any future buyers, right? So here's the situation. You're representing a new buyer. You get under contract. The seller, it's been under contract. The seller gives you all of their disclosures, their transfer disclosure statement, SPQ, natural hazard disclosure, HOA documents, all that stuff that they have to give you, but they also give you former buyers home inspection and pest inspection. They're great for informational purposes for you to have your client review them, but they offer your client zero protection at all. Zero. If that home inspector made a mistake, didn't catch something, your client on this new transaction has zero recourse against that home inspector, because the relationship between your client and that home inspector has no privity of contract. There was no relationship between the two. Therefore, your client has no recourse, cannot go after that home inspector. The only way your client would be protected is if they get their own home inspector and their own home inspector misses something. Okay. So while you can use them for informational purposes, don't rely on them. It's not the same as your client getting their own inspections. You get 17 days here to review the seller disclosures, which would include the private reports. Same with doing preliminary title report, which will be provided by the escrow company. Common interest disclosures. This is like HOA documents. And CC&Rs and things like that. Review of lease or lien items. Let's just say it has a solar system on the house. There's a solar system on the house. You need to figure out. These documents may help. Documents you're getting may help with that. You should also get some contact numbers, so you can get some inquiries. But you need to figure out if the solar system is leased or owned. If it's leased, can that lease be transferred to the buyer? what's required, do they want a credit report, et cetera, and how hook up the buyer to get that started. If they are owned, or if there is some other type of financing involved, there's a case loan, that should be a big red flag to if your buyer is an FHA or VA buyer. There's a case property, FHA or VA buyer will not be able to purchase unless the seller pays off the base loan. So that's something that you pay attention to. And I would offer to you that you're showing property when you need buyers of property. The standard, I've seen there are so many homes out there now with solar system. I just think it should be a standard practice. If you're going to clients focusing on that property, you need as much upfront information as you can about the solar system. What are the circumstances that who owns it? Even if it's owned, is it being financed? How much is left? That would be helpful when you're writing an offer on a property. Because if you're writing an offer on a property, and say you do have an FHA or a VA buyer, when you're writing an offer on a property, and you know there's a financed solar system on the roof and secured with a PACE, why not just negotiate it into your purchase price that the seller must pay off? What's the best? Better to put it in that offer up front than find out about it later and try to negotiate it then, right? If there's a contingency for the sale of the buyer's property or their first purchases, you're going to check this. You're going to attach the COP, which is very detailed, has a lot of options in it depending on whether the property is in the MLS or escrow. How much time the buyer has before they have to remove this contingency, etc. And you'll probably start seeing more of this coming too. Looking down, time of possession. Some people can just be real jerks about this, the seller side and on the buyer side. Bottom line, they have these things they built into here for, on notice of recordation, or you make it 6 p.m. or anytime, right? Well, here's the deal. And one exception to what I'm talking about is where it mentions that TOPA. So generally, when on the day that you close escrow, you're going to get a call from your escrow officer or get an email from your escrow officer. As soon as they get confirmation from the county recorder's office that the deed to your client, the buyer, has been recorded, title company notifies everybody, hey, we're on record, congratulations, right? At that moment, the new buyer owns the property. No ifs, ands, or buts. They own the property. They're entitled to possession. Unless there is an agreement made for the seller to continue possession after. And we'll talk about that in a second. So in the absence of that circumstance, or in the absence of a property being tenant occupied when it closes escrow, and that's what it refers to TOPA form. The new buyer has complete rights to the property. They can go, they can, hopefully you as the buyer's agent, go in there, you'll meet them, congratulate them on their home, you'll get them keys from the lockbox. You don't want to remove keys from the lockbox for the purpose. Violation of MLS, and this would be fine. But once it closes, you take the keys out, give them to the client, welcome them to the home, and we have a client for life. If you ever go online and on our Facebook page, search Jenny Sapien and look at what she does to welcome her buyers to her. She does this massive red carpet treatment. She literally has a red carpet that she pulls out of the house. She's got balloons and all sorts of celebratory stuff to welcome clients to their brand home. So you can do all sorts of stuff. But I love that idea because it really, the neighbors see it and they know They ask questions, they know, oh, my real estate agent is with me. It's a nice way of marketing yourself. If you look at the next section right here, seller occupied or vacant units, it's got these two little boxes you can check. Close of escrow date. So seller occupied or vacant units. What this is saying is this is an occupancy after the escrow. That's what it's. So there's two ways that a buyer can allow the seller to stay in the property for a period of time after escrow closes. And those two ways are, if you're doing 29 days or fewer, that is known as a license. If you go 30 days or later, that is more commonly known as a lease. And while the terms may not ring any bells with you as, so who cares? Legally, they make a big difference. With a license, if on the 32nd day, that seller still has not got that property, with a license, you call up your local law enforcement people. They meet you out of the house and they say, knock, knock, knock. Hello? Time to get out. Leave now. And if they refuse to leave, they can be arrested for trespassing. With a lease, which is for 30 days or more, if the sheriff shows up on day 32 and says, hey, the sellers, buyers are claiming that they need to get into their home, and people inside the house herself say, screw you, I'm not leaving. Law enforcement can't do a thing. What has to happen is the buyers now have to go hire an attorney, and they have to file an unlawful detainer action, commonly known as an eviction, which in Sacramento County can take 3 to 6 months to keep up. Even more so, the buyers now have to continue paying their mortgage payment if they have. They have to continue paying utility bills. If the water gets shut off, even though the squatter essentially is using the water, it's up to the buyer to pay for it, keep it in force. And if the buyer doesn't, he's in violation of county housing laws. So it gets really sucky. So anytime you are negotiating a deal with a seller, you're representing a buyer, you want to stick to 29 days or less, and you want to use a form called an SIP. That's the form name within ZipRecruiter. That is the form that corresponds to 29 days or less. If there is no way you can possibly avoid going 30 or more days after explaining to your client why it is such a bad idea for them to do that, and here is what can happen, and they still insist on it, and they want to do it, after giving them all the appropriate warnings and stuff, use the RLS, which is residential lease for sale. That's the form we never ever want to use. And again, these are examples of why what you don't know is what can hurt you. Because, if you were to go, a seller said, I need 30 days. And instead of asking, well, could you go with 29 days? And you just accept 30, then you just put them in a lease that the buyer may then have to fight. So that's what that is. Tenant occupied units. I talk in my listing presentations about listing houses with tenants. And my recommendation is always going to be, if you're a listing agent, do not list a tenant occupied property. Tenants are a pain in the butt trying to sell a property. They don't like change. They don't want to move. They don't want to take a chance on a new owner jacking up their rents. They will make your life a living hell as a listing agent want to sell that. So my advice always is try to talk your seller into getting the property vacant. Now, that might mean, depending on how long the tenant has been there, that might mean giving the tenant 60 days notice, move. It might mean going without rents for a couple of months. But you want to get top dollar for the house and you want to get it sold in a reasonable period of time, get the tenants out. That said, tenant is in the property. Now, typically, you're representing a buyer and you're going to be buying a property that has a tenant in it. You're probably going to be representing an investor. Probably. But keep in mind that this form, this TOPA that's referenced there, you need to get the seller to complete that form with tenants. And what that form is giving you permission to go onto the farm, inspections, things like that. On the listing side, they need that just to go onto the property to plant a for sale sign, put a lockbox on. Point of fact is, without the tenant's permission, if you even step 1 foot onto the property line, they can have you arrested for trespassing. They have a right of tenancy, gives them complete rights to the 4 corners of the house as well as the 4 corners of the lot. So you can't put a sign there, you can't enter to show it, you can't do anything. The property owner has a reasonable right of inspection after getting notices. But other than that, the tenant doesn't have to allow anything unless it's in the written contract they have itself. All right. I'm going to return escrow. You're going to get stuff during the transaction from the escrow. That's all this stuff. Time to pay fees for HOA documents. If you've sat through my listing presentation class or my listing document class, I talk about telling the seller to order the HOA. Property has an HOA calling it. I talk about having the seller order those HOA documents right at the time of listing or within a day or two afterwards, because the HOA management company can take 10 days to do so. Now, this says that they still have 3 days after contract acceptance to pay the fees in order. I would submit to you that depending on your inspection period, that may not be enough time to get them and the buyer to look at it. So I try to do that way ahead of time. Install smoke alarms, CO detectors, water heater bracing. So the default here is 7 days. I would recommend 3 days in the contract. They should be there already and it should be done already. But here's the deal. Let's just say the buyer's lender is just sharp as hell and they get the appraiser out there the day after you get a ratified contract. Not best. Well, if the water heater isn't strapped, there's missing a CO detector. If there are smoke detectors missing or not working, the appraiser is going to say, I can't complete my job. I'm going to need to come back and verify after these documents, these things were added, put in place. And so the old contract didn't have this provision, but they modified this one a little bit. So the old contract, if something was missing like this, the appraiser would charge the buyer usually $100 trip fee to go back out and verify these items were taken care of. This contract added a provision that says if these things aren't in place, the seller has to pay for the trip fee. So they at least accommodated it that way, which is kind of evidence of representative authority 3 days after consent. What does that mean? Representative authority would apply if the seller were a trust, a business, some sort of a corporate entity, a bank, anything like that. And evidence of representative authority is a document stating that the person signing the contract has the authority to sign. Again, buyers and sellers' signatures. We go to the top of the next page. At a half hour, I got to try to flow through this. So, this section is very self-explanatory. And unlike the MLS, this is actually the binding contract portion. People put all sorts of stuff in MLS. They'll say, yeah, refrigerators included, or, the chandelier in the dining room is not included, but be replaced by the seller. That's something like that. Well, here, everything that's put in here is actually part of the contract. And so, if the MLS says that the refrigerator, washer, and dryer are included, but you don't put that up in here, you don't put that in here, they are not part of the contract. And when the escrow closes, if the seller removes them when he leaves, entirely legal and acceptable. And as a buyer's agent, you didn't put them in after you saw that in the MLS. Guess what? You're buying the client a dishwasher or a refrigerator, washer, and dryer. Simple as that. So take the time to read the MLS, see what it says, and then even talk to your client. Say, look, the MLS says that the refrigerator, washer, and dryer is included. Do you want me to put that in the contract? Do you need them? Or do you want me to not? If you don't put them in the contract, by the same token, when you go out for your final walkthrough, it's a good idea if they're still there. You're expecting refrigerator, washer, and dryer to move. Client expects them gone. They're still there. I want to say to the other side, hey, when's your client going to move? Because we didn't take the contract. Likewise, if there's just as a general rule, if it's part of the real property, it's always included. So, if you have a built-in stove, that's a fixture, that's included as part of it. But if you have a freestanding stove, that's considered personal property. So if the seller wanted to take it, they could, unless you note it here that it is included. Let's see, refrigerators are, they're almost always freestanding, unless you got like a Sub-Zero or something. If it's a Sub-Zero and it's built in, you don't need to specify it in the contract, but I would play it safe, put it in. You just never know. The other side may not know what the law is, and they may not, blink an eye when their seller says, well, I'm going to take Sub-Zero. Okay. So you don't want to. It's easier to make sure you don't have the problems by clarifying. Moving on, natural hazard disclosure or tax information. This defaults actually to seller, at least I think it does. If it doesn't, you should always check seller. Seller is required to provide natural hazard disclosure statement, not a. Problem is, if he does the statement, he's basically doing all the research that goes into it. And he's wrong about any declares on these statutory disclosures. He can be sued. But if he uses one of the third-party reporting companies that produce these natural hazard disclosure reports, the California legislature has given us and your seller a safeguard. They can't be sued if the third-party company makes a good faith mistake. So here, seller's paying for it. In my example, and I didn't check the box, I should have. I just put Cap City NHD. We have our own NHD company who are free to use Cap City. You're free to use Property ID, Disclosure Source. There's like 10 different companies. They all do a pretty good job. I've been pushing Cap City A because it's inter-office, it makes it pretty easy, and B, it's cheap, something not much, $5-10. But since the seller's paying $5-10, it's $5-10. Smoke alarm, CO detector, water heat racing, that seller's taking care of that. This one here, these two here, require point of sale inspections reports, government required point of sale directive media election. So in Sacramento County generally you are not going to check either of those. It's kind of an unwritten feeling, but if you're a listing agent, you ever get an offer on a Sacramento property and somebody has checked one of those boxes, it either means that they're a brand new agent or they're from out of the area. Those boxes are used, but not necessarily here. Where you see those used are in some of the areas in the Bay Area. They have point of sale inspection requirements, that sewer, fire safety sprinkler systems, things like that. San Mateo's fire safety. Some other ones in the Bay Area require a video image done, inspected of the sewer. In Woodland, any newer home, and I don't know what the age cutoff, had to have fire safety sprinklers into that was. So when you sell, they require that fire marshal, fire department go out and run a test water system, fire safety system. They issue a certificate and send it to the escrow company, letting the escrow company know that it was safe escrow. So that's what that's referring to. Escrow fees, usually what's customary around here is they split escrow fees and the seller is the owners. That's the way I devise this example. I have a passion for class or title for Facilia. You use whoever is your favorite escrow officer. You don't know it's your first transaction. Sometimes the seller might have a preference. So law in California is buyer's choice escrow. Buyer is paying all of the fees. Buyer is entitled to choose the title and escrow. However, seller's paying any of it. Seller and buyer's choice goes out. But if you're in competition for a deal with other buyers, other agents, when you pick up the phone, one of my business partners is so good at this. She'll call the other agent. She says, yeah, we're really excited. We really love the home. We're going to write on it. Is there anything in particular your seller needs? Do they need a week extra in the house? Do they need? Do you have title and escrow open with something they already want to use? Trying to get every little favorable treatment she can out of that listing agent by making the offer as palatable to the agent as possible, because that agent can sell it to the seller. So another, more communication. That's all I'm saying. Can help. Little quick little educational thing. An owner's policy of title insurance is known as a CLTA, California Land Title Association. That's what we use here. That insures the seller's title. I'm sorry. That insures buyer's title that is provided by the seller. And that is basically for the value of property. The buyer's lender's title insurance, that's known as an ALTA. It's American Land Title Association. It only protects the buyer's lender and assumes the buyer that is getting. And it is only to the limit of the loan that is being obtained. So that's what goes. Buyer usually pays for that. County and city transfer taxes. The in any county in California, transfer tax rate is $1.10. $1.10 per. Wow. $1.10 per thousand. So just take the whatever the purchase price is, multiply by $1.10. That's what transfer tax is. I put in here county transfer tax, both. So whatever it is, whenever you say both on any of these amounts, there is a presumption within this contract that it refers to 50-50, not 80-20, not possibly 70-30. Whenever you say, always be 50-50 unless you put something else. If you want to put something else, you check both, you fill it in, whatever it is, and it's to that. City transfer tax That's a whole different animal. There are a number of cities that do have transfer taxes. So, an example, city of Sacramento. I'm not talking about something that is considered county. I'm talking about specifically city. So if you see, if you're in an area that has these green street signs, you're in the city of Sacramento. If you sell a property in the city of Sacramento, you not only have a county transfer tax, but you also have a city transfer tax that is a hell of a lot higher than the county transfer tax. Calculation right now is 0.00275 times the purchase price. That gets you city transfer. And if anybody takes and does the numbers, you'll see it is substantially higher. It defaults to seller is paying the fee, preparing HOA disclosures. Buyer pays any HOA certification fee, HOA transfer fee. I always check the seller's paying. Private transfer fee. I want to touch on that for a second. You won't encounter this too much unless you're selling a lot of properties in block newer homes. By newer homes, I mean post early 2000s. Private transfer fees were kind of a strange animal that were out for a short period of time, and then the courts declared but wasn't illegal retroactive. So you have communities, some of like Fittiman and around there. What happened was you had builders who wanted to build, and they were butting heads with like the Sierra Club, these other open space type organizations that wanted to preserve the land. And so in order to be able to build and avoid the years of lawsuits like they were having to fight, the builders struck up a devil's bargain with the Sierra Club and some of those organizations. And what they did is they said, okay, here's the deal. The very first buyer that builder sells to doesn't have to pay this private transfer. However, in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and every time after that, when that house is sold again, this private transfer fee kick in. And the money that is obtained from the private transfer fee go into a trust fund managed by the Sierra Club and other open space preservation companies so that they can acquire more land to stay under forever. And so that is what a private transfer fee is, and that's what it does. And at this point, builders have already sold all the properties that are under this private transfer fee rule. So if you are listing or representing a buyer in one of those areas, the nice thing about this contract, you don't have to do anything in this box. Just take the default because it says the seller is going to pay in transfer. And now, if you're the listing agent, of course, after full disclosure in the MLS that there is a private transfer fee to a buyer, you're free to counter or negotiate that private transfer fee will be split, or the buyer will pay it, or whatever, if you're representing the seller. So just remember, it's always subject to split. There is actually a box check on the MLS system to say there's a private transfer. And if you're in doubt as to whether there is or not, always check the title. Home warranties. I don't care if it's being paid for by the seller or the buyer, but you need to get in the practice. Every deal you do, try to get a home warranty included in the contract. Home warranties can make the difference between getting sued and not sued, because it is much easier for a buyer who thinks they were ripped off, being sold a house with a dying dishwasher, to call their home warranty and pay $75, $90, whatever the service fee is, and get the appliance fixed, it's whatever. Than it is to then file a claim against an agent with a realistically, they're probably not going to do anything other than a small claims court for something like that. But I'm sure you all have better things to do. I know so always push on. All right, next page. So prior to this this version of the purchase agreement, there used to be a lot of other types of purchase. They had separate ones for probate. They had separate ones for mobile home, manufactured housing, so on. The nice thing about this one is they basically got rid of all those separate forms, made those, enacted those as addendums. So if you're writing an offer for mobile home, also known as manufactured housing, you're going to check this box here. It is going to add in this form. Okay. Wait a minute. Sorry, MHA. And then that'll have terms that are specific to making an offer. Okay. If you're dealing with a probate sale and you're putting an offer in, you're going to check this and it'll add in. Yeah. So on and so forth. Makes it really easy. Instead of dealing with the entire form that is going to be there, you get to use the form that you're familiar with, just like 1 or 2 pages. Here, very important I underline this because it's really easy to miss. Actually, 2 things right. If you're buying a property that has a septic, a well, or a propane tank, really want to check this box and add in this form SW. What does the SWP do? Well, problem with, and I'm going to focus on septic systems first. The problem with a septic system is oftentimes they're very easy to find. For those of you who don't know, a septic system in rural property replaces toilet sewage system. All of the toilets and wastewater go into, flow through the ground. They go into this big tank. It's got 2 lids on it. It's usually buried underground. The solids stay in one side. The liquids flow over to the other side. They settle there and then they flow out to what's called leach field, where they sit for years and get broken down by the bugs and stuff. So, problem is septic system need pumped. Most septic tanks are buried usually under 3-4 feet of dirt, which makes them difficult to locate every 5-6 years whenever you have to have them pumped. If you don't pump, they back up, really damaged. So the process of getting a septic inspection requires you hire a septic company to come out to the property. They will, if the septic tank has risers that have already been installed, which are big tubes that go from, they sit on top of where the lids are, and they go all the way to the surface of grass or dirt, and they have a lid on top of them. Very easy to find, very easy to pull the lid off, stick big vacuum hose down there by the septic company provide, and suck all that stuff out, clean it all out. But if they don't have risers, then the septic company has to figure out where the tank is. They have to lids. Well, a lot of times can't figure out where on the property is the exact spot they need to dig to find the lids. So they have to flush these little sensor things that send out beeps, I guess, down the toilets, and they track them with monitors, and they figure out where they finally end up on the property, and that tells them approximately. So then they'll pull out their shovels, and their hope is that they're only like a foot or two ground. It's never the case. They're usually way down. And they'll dig for a few minutes and they'll say, throwing up my hands, we need to get a backhoe. So now they call their office and they bring in on a flatbed this big backhoe. And they bring the backhoe out, they dig up the lids, make enough space so the lids can be pulled off, stick their tube in there, vacuum out all the crap, literally, and then get a flashlight in there and inspect it, get a video in there and inspect it, make sure it's all okay, and then put the lids back on. Or if the homeowner is willing, put risers on it so they can deal with the next. Those cost money too. If they have to bring the backhoe out, you're looking at a cost somewhere around $1,500 to the septic inspection. Now, what this form does, this form says who's responsible for uncovering the lids, who's going to pay for it, and all that good stuff. So you want to do this form when you're doing the contract negotiation, you're representing the buyer, because otherwise the buyer's going to say, well, I need to do my septic inspection. The seller's going to say, have fun with that. And you guys are going to end up arguing back and forth, and you're going to have unhappy people on both sides. It's a no-win situation. You do the form ahead of time, you resolve all those issues up front. Seller knows what they're going to do, buyer knows what they're going to do, who's paying for it, et cetera, et cetera. No argument. Second thing that form does is it talks about the well system. If you're buying a property, you're representing a buyer buying a property that has a well, you want to have a company come out, they will inspect the how many gallons per minute pump system is capable of pumping. They will give you an idea if there's a problem with water table. Is it running out of water? Not. Third thing they do, they'll take a water sample and they'll have it tested for the amount of bacteria, there's certain chemicals in it that might be harmful, so on and so forth. All of these things are things that back and bite you, but if you don't do. These also are things that we specify in that form, who's doing it, who's paying, right? So it's a very important. The one right under it, buyer intent to exchange EXA. That is a form, so you're representing a buyer and find out that the seller is doing a 1031 exchange. What they're supposed to do is put a note in the MLS that says, seller is doing 1031 exchange, buyer agrees to sign paperwork at no cost to buyer. Okay, there's really no effect on the buyer at all. The seller has to disclose that the seller. Now, if that's the case, you're going to add this form and the buyer sign. Also, you might be representing a buyer who is an investor and they're buying this property to complete the 1031 exchange. Same difference. Actually, sorry, this form is for the buyer on the left. The seller intent to exchange is on the right. That's form SXA. BXA was for the buyer. Either one, whatever side of the transaction you're on, if there's a 1031 exchange involved, you want to let's see. These are all checked by default and included with the contract. And then we get down into explanation, all of the stuff checked. I talk again about communication. Don't change your lender, don't change your loan type without communicating to the other side. Not only can that be a breach of the contract and other circumstances, it can also be an ethics violation. You're not communicating very effectively with breach. And ethics violations aren't some minor thing. For those of you who don't know, I sit on pro standards for our association, so I hear ethics cases and two other licensees each panel. We decide on appropriate punishment if there's a violation. There are some ethics violations that you get 15,000 and you get face published on the CAR website. All agents see along with the story of what we do. So, yeah, it's the equivalent of being a terrorist on a post office. You know, most wanted. You don't want that reputation. When it comes to loans, I just have a quick reminder here. Remember, when you're working with a buyer that says they're part getting money from the lender, that is not cash. That is not the same as cash. A hard money loan is exactly what it says. It's a loan. And so, you know, there are people that deal with hard money and they believe that it's the same as cash. It is not. So don't let anybody tell you, especially if you're on the listing side. Oh, limits on credits to buyer. Yeah, that was limits on credits to buyer. You're negotiating a contract. If you're talking about, let's just say the buyer needs money to help closing costs. So you're going to build that in contract. Or down the road, there's an issue about the condition of the property, the right of request for repair. The lender comes, or the agent on the listing agent comes back and said, you know what, we won't do repairs, but we'll give you a credit of $5,000 at closing. Current on closing costs, whatever. Always check with the lender to make sure that the buyer is going to be able to use that, because they may be in part of using a loan program that, because of their debt to income ratio, whatever, they don't fit that box perfectly. They may not be able to accept credit more than accept. So just check the buyer's lender before you agree to that. It would be a shame if, in lieu of repairs, the seller agrees to give your guy $5,000. Then the lender has to tell the buyer, I can only use $2,000. The $3,000 just goes away. So that's that. We already talked about sellers remaining in possession at the close of escrow, the difference between a license and lease, condition of property closed. Property should be delivered as is condition, subject to any repairs the seller to do. Seller should remove all their personal property. One thing that's important to note here is that if the seller refuses to remove all of their personal garbage left behind, that's not considered a breach, which the buyer can either refuse to put escrow, or the buyer can delay escrow. What the buyer can do, contract with some permission, is after they close escrow and send a demand that the seller needs to improve it. If they don't, after a reasonable period of time, the buyer, who's now the owner, can pay somebody to haul the stuff away to the dump. They can send a demand to the seller to pay that, reimburse them. If they don't, they can sue them. A lot of times it's a no situation. If the seller's moved out of state, you're not going to pursue the person out of state, sue them by paid garbage. So it's kind of it's a sucky thing that people would fire, but it doesn't. Last thing I'll is liquidated damage through deviation arbitration. Yes. All right. So in order to negotiate a contract in which the buyer's earnest money deposit is subject to liquidated damages, both buyer and seller must be initial. If this is not initial, what that means is you no longer get the option of the simple solution reached by the buyer. Now the seller can actually sue the buyer for real, true action damages, which might be a lot more than percent. That's why it's important to obtain signatures. You will find that the clients you have that will be most adverse to initial fees and to initialing arbitration are lawyers. Lawyers don't like to give away their rights to litigate. And the beauty of having a license to practice law in California means you don't have to hire a lawyer to represent in order to go into Superior Court. Whereas any layman that wants to go into Superior Court and get sued has to hire. So you just can't represent yourself. So those are the ones that will be against it. You should still push back and try to get it. Mediation clause and arbitration, these are the last two. Mediation is a solution as well as arbitration. There are solutions to avoid that. Mediation, we have a center set up with PAR. We have a real estate mediation center, kind of acts as the coordinator for disputes mediation. The beauty of mediation is gets the parties talking together. There is no requirement, there's nothing binding on this part of stuff. So if you go into mediation, each party pays a portion. It's a lot cheaper than hiring lawyers. And the mediator is usually a lawyer, usually a real estate lawyer, and a broker. He will basically separate the parties, try to come up with a solution that is palatable to each of them, and come up with a compromise. If you get a compromise, they will memorialize it into the stipulated agreement. Everybody signs it, everybody goes through, and that's the end of the story. Mediation isn't mandatory or isn't binding, so it's all voluntary. So they don't have to agree to anything. If you can't handle it through mediation, then the next step before court is arbitration. Arbitration is very much like what's called a bench trial, where you have a single person bench trial, that's the judge. He takes evidence, he looks at briefs, he reads all the information, he might ask questions, and then he will make the decision. Yes, I'm awarding you X. Yes, I'm awarding you this. And whatever his decision is fine. That's the way arbitration works. Now, can you avoid arbitration? One circumstance in a real estate contract where you can avoid this is if the other party refuses and they refuse to arbitrate. If they refuse to mediate, refuse to arbitrate, then they can correct you. And by court, that can be small claims court, depending on the other way they can avoid arbitration is if the amount of damages is less than $10,000. Plaintiff would correct to small claims, does not stop. But mediation and arbitration can save us. Beautiful. But all parties have to initial. And remember, on page 14 to 16, there's two places on the bottom: buyers and sellers initial, as well as dated damage. Claim, it's all the key stuff that I want to discuss.